This week, we speak with Rebecca Deck from Avalara. In the news segment, we look at a case for better filters. Attackers make a dash for Ruby that underscores the need for dependency security, the craft work of threat models, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 104, recorded April 20th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Mike. It's finally sunny in Colorado. No more snow for now.
That's good. It means you can go outside. Oh, wait. Sorry.
No, we can go outside. We can go outside in Colorado.
Okay, good.
There's a big protest at the State House this week, so we're not forbidden to go outside. We can get our exercise.
Get your exercise and stay safe. Well, we also have Mr. John Kinsella. How you doing, John?
Good morning. Happy Monday. I'm doing good. It's right outside, but live about 10-15 minutes to Sunday.
We have officially migrated our mailing list back to our original platform. We apologize for any double mailings or lack of mailings that you may have received in the interim. We have our categories nailed down, and you are now able to customize what you receive from us based on your preferences by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. Once you have joined, you will also be able to go back and update your interests so that we can grow with you as you progress through your journey in InfoSec. Going cloud native? See how to integrate application security in our next webcast with Signal Sciences. Learn how penetration testing reduces risk in our May webcast with Core Security, a health systems company. Register for our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts. You can also access our on-demand library of previously recorded webcasts and trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. Each webcast will earn you 1 CPE credit that we will submit on your behalf if you provide your ISC² number. Rebecca Deck is a staff application security engineer at Avalara. She determines application security tools and strategy and, hopefully, gets to perform application security testing. She has more than 20 years of experience in IT that includes QA, software development, engineering, incident response, and consulting. She's currently quarantined with her wife and kids, living the dream of working and homeschooling. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, the theme for this segment is building an AppSec ecosystem. And it's one thing to build in this kind of ecosystem against a checklist of things you should have. It's another to build things that move AppSec beyond checklists. So this is a big question. Well, I guess we'll start big and dig in more, but how do we do more of that and make AppSec successful, moving beyond just checklists?
So part of what we're doing is using threat modeling to drive this whole process. So we built out a whole application ecosystem with threat modeling kind of at the center of that in order to come up with what developers need to do to help guide them. And then we can also feedback in through that threat modeling process to make sure that we're doing a continuous improvement on all of our development processes.
So I personally love threat modeling and love to talk about it, but I also know it kind of can be laden with traps or can also feel burdensome for teams. So even as we talk about threat modeling, what are some of the strategies you've adopted or things that you've learned over time to make that actually a positive experience for DevOps teams or developers that you're working with?
Yeah, so I try to do as much as I can myself as far as helping people to understand what needs to be done. I always follow the model of I'll do one with you watching, let you do one with me watching, and then you can do yours with me overseeing it. So I try to pass those off to application security teams as I can. But part of what we want to do is make sure that we're not overburdening them, mainly with findings, is where people start running into trouble. And sometimes I try to, it helps a lot if you can guide teams as far as what good findings look like. So some of the things that we'll do is like all of our security standards, right? If we have a security standard, then that security standard is going to get rolled into our threat model as findings that show up automatically based on what that architecture looks like. So that way, if somebody says that they're using EC2 hosts, then I'm going to give them different findings than if they have containers, right? Because you secure those in different ways and different parts of the standards apply to them. Because a lot of times the most frustrating things for teams is they get a bunch of findings that don't really apply to them out of their tooling, and then they get really discouraged with that, right? They have 100 things to fix, and then they spend 4 hours on something only to find out that that wasn't really something that was applicable to them. So that's why we try to drive threat modeling to only give teams what they actually need to be doing. And I try to keep I'm an engineer, and so I don't like things that are like magic and require everybody to have this ability to look at their system and do a great job of critically assessing that, like a threat modeling expert might do. So we try to build what we can into the threat models to help them to take most of that away. And then they're just left trying to think up a couple of creative ideas that we may have left out of the standards. And if that's the case, then that gives us an idea, hey, this is something we need to roll back into our standard process.
So you even get false positives in a threat model as well.
Yeah, absolutely, right? If all I do in my threat model, if I don't have that intelligence built in, so say we have a requirement that no EC2 host will be exposed directly to the internet without having like a load balancer in front of it, right? Or we have a security control like a WAF that also has to be in front of it. Well, if you have something that doesn't necessarily apply to, or say you already have that load balancer, right? And your threat modeling tool is telling you, hey, you need to include a load balancer. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? Or you have some vague generalities that maybe they don't understand. Or I don't want to be telling you steps to remediate issues with S3 buckets on your EC2 host, right? Because those are drastically different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm curious. There's a number of different frameworks out there for threat modeling. Did you adopt one, or did you kind of create your own? Just curious, kind of what your model and framework looks like.
Yeah, so vaguely follow Stride, but like I said, most of it isn't necessarily going to be done with running through Stride, right? Most of what people are coming up with. And it's funny when I talk to people who previously worked at different companies from threat modeling, and I ask them, what kind of findings did you get out of it? The main thing that people seem to get out of threat modeling is we needed to enable TLS on all our websites, right? We couldn't serve plain text connections. And I really think that's underselling what we can do with threat modeling. So I feel like this takes a lot of that out of it, right? That people don't need to have that magic. It's engineering. So we have these sets of rules that all of our standards say, this is what you need to do. If you make an S3 bucket, you have to do all these things. If you make an EC2 host, you need to do these things. If you're accepting input from the client, you need to validate these in accordance with these kind of objectives. So we certainly do training with developers to try to understand a little bit about what comes out of it. But you can do a lot with just the tooling. So like a lot of times I'll use some of the paid tools, but I think the Microsoft threat modeling tool is a good one because it supports those templates. And that's kind of your injection point to be able to say as a security team, look, I may not be sitting here with you doing this threat model, but based on what's in this template, I can tell you pretty reliably just by you checking these boxes and filling out kind of the questionnaire that's provided within the threat modeling tool. I can reliably tell you what you have and haven't done to that and what kind of things apply to those specific components. So as an application security team, I spend a lot of my time focused on making sure that our threat modeling tool is giving good results to our software developers and our security champions, because you kind of have to rely on the security champions to do some of this at some point, right? As a security team, you generally don't have the bandwidth to deal with like 100 developers per security person.
Right.
How much time are you spending on that? Or when you talk about the developer's time, is reading through like the standards, understanding what are they deploying to an S3 bucket? What's the checklist reference they need to make sure to be cognizant of? Is having that box of TLS turned on. How much time do you often spend? Do you see developers spend on threat modeling? And what are some ways that you try to aim for to reduce the time or make it feel that it's more effective for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I said, making sure that they have those valid findings coming in. We do a little bit of training. So we split off security champions from every team. So everywhere I've ever worked, that's the first thing we do is start delineating, picking out security champions to be that representative from the application security team on the development team. And they're always developers because we have so many of the developers. And people usually want to do that, right? It's good for developers now to know security. It's a very marketable skill for them. So we don't usually have a problem with getting people to volunteer for it. But spending a little bit of time with security champions, brown bag lunches, some just intro training on it. And like I said, I'll do one with the developer sitting there so they can kind of see what comes out of it, how to use the tools. But yeah, that helps keep the developers' time, because that's really sacred, right? We want the developers make money for the company usually, right? Security is not, we're more of like a cost point than we are actually driving the business. So that's why we try to be as respectful as we can of developers' time, realizing that they have other work to do that makes the company money.
So that's kind of interesting, especially on that aspect of they got other work to do. And your background as an engineer, how often have you seen them, or what are the ways that you've worked with like threat modeling and say, rather than having this discussion about TLS or an S3 configuration, you or the dev teams have been able to do something that just automatically changes a secure default or automatically has a config flip that just makes that better for everyone, so you don't have to focus on some of those minor details?
Yeah, so one of the other things that the application security team can provide are these secure application defaults, right? So we can say, here's an approved architecture that we've seen. We threat model out this architecture, and then developers can just pull that architecture in if that's what they've done, the standard kind of archetype. And then the threat model is mostly complete at that point, unless they've changed things, right? They might change what database they're using on the back end, or they might have other components on the internet that they interact with, that kind of thing. But that way they already know. Now, another thing that you can do that's really great once you have those archetypes is you can do something like develop one of my bosses came up with this idea was you can make Terraform templates for all those. Mm-hmm. So, or whatever you're using. So you create these secure templates that already have all those boxes checked. So that way, when a developer needs to do something, you're actually helping enable developers to develop by giving them this template. So all they have to do is grab it, run it. They've already built things out, modify the template to fit their needs, and then modify the threat model with whatever modifications they've made. And then their work is largely done. So we've had really good reception from development teams on that idea that Look, we know that this is a time-consuming thing, so we'll do whatever we can to make this easy for you and to help automate this, because now developers don't even have to come up with their own default Terraform templates, right? They already have that and can build off it.
Yeah,
So
otherwise they're just going to pull a container from a Git repository that's got a bunch of bad stuff in it anyways.
Yeah, and sometimes when we look at like containers, we can't, so you can certainly specify like, hey, we're going to follow the CIS templates or something on these specific containers. But developers might also pull in other containers. Maybe they're using like a COTS system and they don't have complete control over what these containers look like. So you still end up needing a lot of the things that come out of the threat model. But in that case, you can still delete that component, replace it with a container, and then all those findings that would have been already implemented show right back up as requirements that you need to make sure go in there. And then when we have these threat models, we can use them for all of our different teams. So the developers, the red teams, the blue teams, architecture teams, QA, privacy and compliance can all refer back to these threat models, and they all get something out of it when they look at the developers have done these things or they haven't done these things. So it makes it really easy for a lot of different teams. So that's kind of why the application security team has become like this focal point at most places I am, where everybody funnels through us because we have this kind of information to give to developers. And then as those teams come up with their requirements for what they need to do, then those standards get rolled right back into our threat modeling. So again, that's that continuous improvement idea.
So that's got to be a good way then to have some type of metric or some way of measuring the effectiveness of either the coverage of the threat modeling, or when you're talking about like the Terraform and having effectively templates. I would imagine like the more that Terraform configuration grows, that's kind of a good sign for how easier it is for devs just to start from a good secure baseline. Do you have something that's some other ways of looking at that from a metrics perspective, or how to measure that, yeah, we're doing threat modeling and actually it's being effective or it's being helpful and informative for these other teams?
Yeah, so when we look at doing metrics, the way that I always like to do it is you kind of start with plotting out what all the various security activities are that you're doing within your SDLC. And some of those are necessarily going to occur very late, like application security testing of that specific app, or even notifications through bug bounty programs or third-party notifications of vulnerabilities on your site. So those come at this tail end of the SDLC. And something like threat modeling comes right at the beginning of the software development lifecycle. So what you can do is we can say, like one of the things that we always provide are JIRA tickets. So whether it comes in or whatever your defect tracking solution is, so whatever you find in the threat modeling tool that they aren't already complying with, then those become these tickets in the defect tracking system. And you can see, well, we found all these things with threat modeling. So initially, when you start out a program, you start and you are finding very little with threat modeling. And then you'll have this kind of diagram of where you find your vulnerabilities. Is it in dynamic testing or static testing? Or is it third parties? And as you start out, most of your findings are going to be way over on that tail end of it. And you should be seeing that curve kind of change. So once you've done good threat modeling, you should see it look a lot more like that, where you have a lot of threat modeling findings, and then that should starve out these later things. Like, so you start looking at your SaaS technologies and saying, all right, well, what am I still finding here? What are my DAS technologies finding? What am I finding on these penetration tests? Do I still need to do penetration tests quarterly anymore? So you can really look at that ROI for what you're getting out of all your tools. And so you can even come up with defect per hour types of rates. So you can say, well, penetration testing now is costing us this much money per defect, whereas threat modeling is costing us just this much money per defect. And then that makes a really strong business case for, yeah, we are actually seeing strong results that translate into actual dollars for our company. Come out of each one of these security technologies. That way you can see as your program progresses And it really lets you it tells a great story when you start talking to executives.
I can see how that might cause that'll show you the cost of let you track the cost behind your threat modeling. How do you can you think of a metric, or maybe I just missed on what you said, a metric around getting results from that threat modeling? In other words, if you find a vulnerability through a network scanner and there's an open port and you patch it, you've got a very sort of concrete thing there. Are you able to get to that level around threat modeling?
Yeah, so what you do with the threat model is generally everything that's found. So every issue that's in a threat model ends up getting listed as an issue. So we track those in our threat modeling tool. So you can say, all right, all these, if you were, say, using a secure archetype, right, all of these things were already done when they got the archetype. We didn't even have to file tickets that were worked by developers in the backlog. So I guess if I were doing this without that kind of thing integrated into my tool set, I might do it I might still have the tickets created as long as you can do it in an automated fashion inside of my defect tracking system as already remediated. And then you can see this was a finding that was fixed with secure templates that we didn't have to worry about. These are findings that were in the threat model that were not remediated by it, that required defect tracking in order to remediate, and the developers later remediated them, or they were remediated during design time or during the actual runtime. So I think that's one of the weird things with threat modeling sometimes is it gets a little amorphous on what kinds of threats you may have avoided. And some of them aren't going to be as cut and dry as we check this box on the S3 bucket. Some of them are nebulous. Did we validate input here when we were doing this story? Those are a little more difficult to track. So right now we're kind of going with our developers and get to say, yeah, I've done that, right? I've checked these inputs. And then when developers are writing stories, they go back and they check these same boxes. Have I done all these things? But that way you end up you should see a pile of things over on the threat model that were detected in the threat model or made it in the defect tracking system and were remediated by developers before going anywhere, or got caught by SAST or DAST or any of the other tools down the line. So you should watch those other tools drop. So even if you can't track directly what's coming into the threat model, you should still see everything else getting starved out and dying. So you should see your SAST tool will find progressively fewer and fewer findings. Your DAST tool will provide fewer findings, and then finally penetration testing and your bug bounties or whatever third-party notifications, those should be very low towards the end.
I like John's question because we instinctively know that if you're addressing certain threats early in the cycle, they're a lot cheaper and easier to fix versus at the end, right, when they're in production. But as you were describing, the concept is fantastic, right? But then as you see things like SAST, DAST, and other findings drop off, does that give a false sense that you don't need those tools anymore? How do you balance that? Because now you're going to look at your investment on some of these tools and go, well, do I really still need to make the investment there if I've shifted it all into the threat model?
Honestly, if I can start getting rid of tools, that's great. I think being in security and being a parent, those are two jobs that you always are trying to work yourself out of. So far, I've never actually seen anybody be able to get rid of those. But you can at least give the executives risk-based kind of, you can give them much better metrics on, look, here's what we're still going to be missing off this, or should we go with a cheaper tool, or do we need to do this as often? Those kinds of things. Or do we need to do penetration testing every quarter? Or can we do it once a year instead because we have reasonable assurance that we're doing a good job on these things? So far, I've never actually gotten to the point where people are saying we no longer need this tool at all, but maybe scale back usage on it. So if you haven't found anything on your DAST tool in 6 months, that does make it extremely difficult to justify the cost of that tool. So you might look into cheaper alternatives with it. But that's all going to be, at that point, you can at least make a business decision out of it. Because what I don't like to do, because again, I'm an engineer, I don't like to say, look how scary this is going to be if we get rid of this thing, right? Look how scary it's going to be if we get rid of antivirus. But if you have metrics that say antivirus hasn't had a valid hit in the last 6 years, well, maybe it's time to look at a better technology than that can replace it.
I think we can also answer that question by looking at how threat modeling can give us a better idea of how to target a class of vulnerabilities. So, for example, rather than having SAST or DAST say, oh, here's another CSRF, here's another CSRF, or here's another XSS test, or here's another XSS vuln we found, and here's another one that's reflected, this one is stored, etc. You can actually use threat modeling and say, we have a CSRF problem, we have an XSS problem. What are the ways that we could actually shift to get rid of this class of issues? And if that's where we've talked about a lot in the past, say, here is your framework that has CSRF support, or here is moving to something like a React.js front end where XSS is actually really difficult. And I like how you were describing it starving out of a technology, perhaps. And one of the ways is also I'm getting to here is that angle of using threat modeling to starve out a class of vulnerability, so that rather than having to rely on the most accurate scanning tool near the right-hand side, if you will, of that SDLC, you're actually doing something that makes it hard to introduce those flaws in the first place. And then you're refocusing that tooling onto something else, or using penetration testing, or even a bug bounty program to clean up those few corner cases where something might have slipped through because it was a corner case, so to speak. But that's another way I would kind of start to answer that question that, John, you brought up, and the way that you were talking about Rebecca, using threat modeling to inform and ideally get rid of the tools, because you're actually making it harder for developers to introduce flaws within this app ecosystem.
Yeah, so like one thing you might look at, a great example of these are HTTP response headers, the security headers.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of the bane of my existence, right? But if I provide you secure configurations for Apache, if I write a Lambda at edge function so that when you have CloudFront, you are already sending these correct security headers back from that. If I can do that job for you, then that will completely defeat that class of vulnerabilities, right? If you look at the threat modeling tool and you acknowledge, yes, I've used this secure configuration, or yes, I'm pulling the secure configuration from your templates, then that will never happen, because those are some of the things that are kind of costly for me as an application security team when you have to field bug bounty reports or something like that, saying, oh, you're missing the XSS protection header or something silly like that. It's not that big of a deal. But you can completely defeat that and not have to worry about even fielding those. And that in and of itself can be a pretty big cost savings.
So actually jumping onto that end, you mentioned bug bounty there as well. Part of the threat modeling is those initial questions: what are you building? What could go wrong? Every once in a while, and this is true for pretty much any company out there, regardless of the maturity of their security org, how well sandboxed their application is, et cetera, they'll have a bug bounty report, or they'll have a pen test team come in and have some findings. So, and that is that sort of fifth question of threat modeling, if you will, of something did go wrong. So how then when something did go wrong and you get that bug bounty report or a pen test finding, how do you feed that back into this threat modeling loop? And does that influence the discussions you have around, those conversations you've had with the developers?
Yeah, so this is a talk that I'm putting together for Circle CityCon this year, is on how to do a good recappa on things, the root cause analysis. And so what you want to do is every time something comes in, you should be asking yourself, why did we miss this? Right? What is wrong with the process that's here? Not who's to blame for this or anything like that, right? Once you're through that initial, okay, we've triaged this and we've remediated whatever based on the severity. So with the root cause analysis process, there should always be a reason that findings aren't showing up. So that way you can say, what technologies missed this, or what technologies could have gotten this? And then you can work back and say, how can we make these technologies catch this? How can we make sure that this doesn't recur? And then you can use threat modeling to help communicate that to the development teams. That's how you get your new standards, roll those out, and then the development teams can make those assessments and say, right now we've gotten rid of this entire problem. It's not going to show up anywhere anymore.
Yeah, it's that constant feedback loop to make sure that those archetypes are still valid when you find something that goes wrong in production. And if you don't do that, then obviously your threat models start to kind of veer off, not as effective, not as cost efficient, I guess, at that point. So it's making sure that those loops get closed.
Yeah.
I'm curious, one of the other things you said earlier is, as you build these archetypes, I can imagine there's a lot of other disciplines outside of just the AppSec teams, because now with the way applications are being developed, the way, whether it's CloudFormation or the different templates, right, that are being built, you're also dealing with a lot of infrastructure components. And so I imagine you have to work closely with the infrastructure and networking teams, the host build teams, et cetera, to make sure that these archetypes are getting built correctly and then available for the development team so that they're leveraging the right configurations. Are you seeing that AppSec is taking more of a kind of a central role in the security teams, bringing together the host and networking teams together in your organizations?
Yeah, definitely. That's something I like to be kind of that focal point, right? I want people coming through me because I can keep messaging consistent that way. So when developers are writing code, they're not getting hit up by 8 different teams saying, hey, now you owe me this, now you owe me that. I can use my threat models, my artifacts that are created to help all these other teams. So if you have to get onboarding with the blue team, or you have to go through the architecture review board, everybody should be coming through me on that. If there's problems, then we need to go engage other teams. So if we have to go talk to operations teams, depending on however your organization's set up, because a lot of times developers are doing that work for you, then we have that ability as an application security team. We'll go over there. And again, it's about shielding these developers from having to do things that are going to interfere with their work.
Yeah, I think that's a great model, just because I see applications being kind of this central component, as we think about how organizations are transforming. They're transforming through the application. Why make the developers have to learn networking and the endpoint security stuff if the AppSec team can do it and talk their language? It just takes a lot of that confusion and that learning curve just completely out of the equation for them.
Yeah, and I still do talks on it, right? I don't want to send developers out and saying, oh, well, developers never have to worry about this, because like we said with frameworks and stuff, maybe you already have a framework that does it, and maybe later somebody wants to use a new framework that doesn't do that, and those skills become required again. So we still like to go back and teach people that baseline, but it's not quite as imperative, right? You can have longer times in between those trainings. The more things that you've already gotten rid of.
Cool. And you had mentioned too, in the training, also speaking of like getting rid of a tool. I don't think you're trying to get rid of your own job, but you have mentioned like security champions and just now training. Are there any particular ways or strategies you've come up with to help developers be more self-serving around threat modeling, or being able to hand off to security champions so that you can maintain a focus and some good unified messaging, but still distribute some of that load to others?
Yeah, so once you've kind of run through it with developers, especially if you have the tool doing a lot of the work for them, developers are reasonable at picking that up. You still obviously need to watch them, because not all development teams are going to be at the same skill level. And sometimes they're going to have different drivers, right? Some teams are under more pressure than other teams. So you may, sometimes you're going to have to do a little bit more work on it. But we do regular classes everywhere I've ever been. That's one of my favorite things to do. It's good for the developers to get the classes, and it's good for various members of the application security team to teach classes to people as a professional development type of scenario. So that way those junior people can move up and become seniors and have that kind of progression, and people feel like they're moving up in their job. So I think it also helps a little bit with retention to have that kind of thing.
Cool. Well, you've definitely taught us quite a bit around threat modeling and some smart ways to approach that within the SDLC and how using feedback loops with the other tools. You had mentioned your upcoming talk. Is there anything more about that in particular you wanted to highlight here, or something else that we should be looking forward to over the next couple of months?
Sadly, almost everything's canceled, so a lot of stuff is going to end up falling down, getting through the cracks this year. But yeah, so at my Circle CityCon talk, I'll be talking about specifically root cause analysis for some of the systems that I've seen, some of the issues that we found that where we did bad root cause analysis and it caused us to lose a bunch of money and possibly have people change jobs over it. And then other times where we've done good root cause analysis and how that really helped out the organization to stem these kind of systemic problems.
That sounds. I know people especially like to learn from the mistakes that other people make. So actually, that does sound like a good hook.
I've made a lot of them.
And a good amount of transparency. You're not alone, trust me. And we do. And you're also not alone in this discussion. Thank you very much for this, and thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. This was a really good talk.
All right, thank you.
Also want to thank Matt and John for joining us, and want to thank all of you listeners as well. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to return with news of the week.